When a place is designed to hold people until they break, the original concept and thought process behind the structure is left behind. This was not a place of healing or passage. It was a place of control, built on silence, solitude, and the belief that isolation could reform the human mind. The walls separated, the cells stripped identity, and the quiet did the rest. Sitting directly on the street in busy Philadelphia, this structure reads as a museum filled with history. But when the lights fade and the corridors empty, the space behaves differently. Sounds carry where it shouldn't, stillness feels deliberate, and the absence of people somehow feels crowded. This episode is not about spectacle or haunted house theatrics. It's about a system that asked men to sit alone for years with nothing but their own thoughts and what may have lingered after the doors finally opened. I'm Johnny Clash, a dad, a gamer, a former pro wrestler, and a lifelong observer of the unexplained. I'm not here to convince or dismiss. I'm here to listen, to document, and to sit with questions that do not resolve easily. This is Paranormal Unsettled. Eastern State Penitentiary is often described as a monument to punishment, but that framing only tells part of the story. It was built to correct behavior by breaking habits through psychological torture. Solitude was intended to lead to reflection, and reflection to reform. Instead, it produced a place where time slowed, voices vanished, and identity eroded. I'm not approaching this location as a virtual visitor looking for spectacle. Much of Eastern State is not even safe to explore. I'm approaching it with the focus on what happens to the human mind when a person is left alone for months or even years. This is a solid structure shaped by long overnight shifts, guards pacing empty cell blocks, and the routine management of hundreds, sometimes thousands, of prisoners meant to be unseen and unheard. The building absorbed those rhythms, the pauses, the waiting, the repetition. This history may become uncomfortable as we examine a system that believed prolonged isolation and other forms of torture were humane. Eastern State does not shout its story. The longer you listen, the harder it becomes to separate documented history from whatever still seems to linger within its walls. To set the stage, Eastern State Penitentiary opened in 1829 in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, as one of the most ambitious social experiments in American history. Designed around the Pennsylvania system, a radical philosophy held that solitude and silence would lead prisoners to reflect on their crimes and reform. Unlike early prisons focused on public punishment, Eastern State aimed to be orderly, controlled, and moral. Its existence represented a shift in how society addressed crime. The architecture was revolutionary. A radial layout extended cell blocks outwards like the spokes from a central hub. Guards could observe multiple wings from a single point while keeping prisoners in check. Each cell was for one inmate only, a concept uncommon at the time. The prison drew visitors from around the world, including writers, politicians, and prison reformers. It was a model and an example. But prisoners spent nearly all of their time alone in cells, around 23 hours a day, eating, sleeping, working, and just reflecting. They wore hoods when they were moved to prevent seeing or being seen by others. Even names were just replaced by numbers. The goal was complete separation from outside influence and internal temptation. Every single piece of your identity was stripped away. Despite reformative intent, the system revealed its psychological toll. Many inmates suffered severe mental health issues, including anxiety, hallucinations, depression, and nervous breakdowns. Some even lose their ability to speak normally. Observers began to question whether solitude corrected behavior or quietly destroyed those subjected to it, and the proof was there. But deep inside of what was believed to be the world's first penitentiary, isolation wasn't the only form of punishment here, with some other methods resulting in severe injury and sometimes death. The iron gag, for example, was used on inmates who spoke when they weren't supposed to. In 1833, Matthias Macumsey, serving time for manslaughter, tried to talk to his neighbor in the adjacent cell. Guards bound his hands behind his back, placed a cast iron gag over his tongue attached to the shackles, and left him. An hour later, he was found dead with his tongue ripped out and bleeding. Sorry for the graphic details. Other punishments were equally cruel. The mad chair, designed to restrict all movement, forced inmates to sit so tightly strapped that it was literally impossible to move. Some endured days in the chair without food, causing blood flow restrictions that often led to bodily damage or even the need for amputations. The water bath was another cruel punishment, particularly in the winter. Inmates who broke rules could be dunked in ice-cold water and then hung on the wall all night. Now, frigid temperatures would freeze the skin before morning, and many did not survive. Now, by the mid-19th century, criticism grew. Charles Dickens, the author of A Christmas Carol, Oliver Twist, and Great Expectations, toured Eastern State and later wrote harshly about the psychological damage that he witnessed on his trip. Other prisons adopted alternative methods, emphasizing labor and limited interaction rather than total isolation. Eastern State continued largely unchanged for decades, somehow just sweeping it all under the rug. Overcrowding eventually eroded original principles here at Eastern State. Cells designed for one sometimes held 2 or more inmates. The strict silence rules were relaxed. What began as a controlled experiment gradually became a more conventional prison, though the architecture and atmosphere remained oppressive. What once held 400 inmates was now housing thousands. Harsh disciplinary methods added to the contradictions. Prisoners breaking rules could be confined in dark underground cells with little air or light. These practices contradicted the prison's moral mission and fueled public concern. The gap between intention and reality widened. By the early 20th century, Eastern State was considered outdated. Modern corrections philosophy moved away from extreme isolation. The aging facility required constant maintenance. And in 1971, after more than 140 years, it officially closed. Remaining inmates were transferred elsewhere and the building was left abandoned. For years it sat in decay. Nature crept in, paint peeled, silence returned in a different form. The prison became a haunting reminder of past ideals and consequences. Its empty corridors preserved architecture and emotional weight alike. Today, Eastern State is studied as both an architectural landmark and cautionary tale. It tells a story of control, reform, and unintended harm. History here does not feel distant but suspended, asking visitors to confront what happens when isolation is mistaken for healing. Now, the shift towards paranormal interpretation did not happen all at once. For decades after closure, Eastern State was viewed primarily as a failed social experiment and decaying historical site. It's not hard to miss either. If you drive up Fairmount Avenue, there it is, right on the street, looking like a castle sticking out like a sore thumb. But the abandonment of the building changed its perception entirely. The empty cell blocks and infirmary, echoes of wind through broken windows all create an atmosphere that invited emotional reactions. Visitors described feeling watched, unsettled, or uneasy long before the ghost stories emerged. In the late 20th century, pop culture began framing historical trauma through narrative and sensation. Haunted locations offered a way to process difficult histories. Eastern State fit neatly into this narrative. It was old, imposing, and tied to suffering. Stories didn't need invention. The emotional weight already existed. Television amplified the transformation. Paranormal TV shows featured Eastern State as rich with potential evidence. Dark hallways, crumbling cells, the strange sounds made compelling visuals. Focus slowly shifted from why the prison failed to what might still remain. The public tours adapted. Historical interpretations remained central, but guides referenced cold spots, shadow figures, and disembodied sounds. Guests drew their own conclusions. Education and mystery coexisted, shaping the site's identity forever. Now, Halloween events cemented the paranormal reputation. Along with the belief that something was still inside of Eastern State, there was always skepticism, much like any haunted location. Some argued that the environment and expectation explained the sensation of others. This tension between belief and doubt added some complexity rather than resolution. But Eastern State's paranormal identity now exists alongside its historical one. Ultimately, the shift is not about proof but attention. Eastern State reacts to visitors. The paranormal lens offers engagement with unanswered questions. Modern audiences shape the story as much as the prison itself. Now let's get to it because we have not mentioned his name yet, but the most enduring name tied to Eastern State is Al Capone. Though he served only a short sentence there in 1929, alongside famous bank robbers such as Slick Willie Sutton and Bill Miner, his presence was permanently altered how the prison is remembered. Unlike the majority of inmates who endured extreme conditions, Capone occupied a private cell furnished with rugs, paintings, a cabinet radio, and better lighting. This contrast became symbolic. It highlighted inequality inside the walls and reinforced the idea that power could bend even the most rigid system. Capone's cell has since become the most visited and photographed space in the prison. Visitors report a strange energy there, including unexplained noises, sudden temperature changes, and feelings of uneasy. Paranormal investigators often focus their sessions in this cell, not because Capone suffered the most. He didn't even die there. He was barely in this cell. But because the legacy carries weight. The cell represents corruption and privilege and the illusion of control inside a system designed to strip identity away. And for the Boardwalk Empire fans who are familiar with Stephen Graham's portrayal of Al Capone, his co-star Steve Buscemi actually narrates the popular Voices of Eastern State audio tour on premise today. Now let's get back to the paranormal television shows. During their investigation of Eastern State Penitentiary, the Ghost Adventures crew documented what they believed to be some of the most intense paranormal activity of their careers. Throughout the lockdown, they captured multiple EVPs that appear to be direct and intelligent, including the words hungry, I knew God, hi, Nick, and a clear warning of get out. Alongside the voices, the team records disturbing residual noises such as doors opening, scratching sounds, heavy footsteps, and screaming echoes throughout the cell blocks with no visible source. One of the most alarming moments occurs when a man's scream is heard and the camera immediately loses power, which the crew interprets as a sudden energy drain. Visually, Aaron reports seeing a shadow figure standing at the end of the cell block, though it's not captured on the digital still camera. Later, using that same camera, the team photographs a mist emerging from the glowing doorway, which Zach suggests may represent an apparition or a doorway to the other side. By the end of the episode, the crew concludes that the prison's history of isolation and suffering has left behind a powerful and oppressive energy, solidifying Eastern State Penitentiary as one of the most haunted locations they have ever investigated. But now, in one of the early seasons of Ghost Hunters, the crew also investigated Eastern State and captured some captivating evidence which appears to be a person standing up, turning quickly, and walking away. They tried to recreate it, but the evidence puzzled the crew so much that they returned for a second investigation later that night and personally captured some shadow figures as well as some voice anomalies. But now, television isn't the only form of media using Eastern State as its focal point. The prison served as a filming location for the movie 12 Monkeys, a post-apocalyptic science fiction thriller. Now, one of the largest cultural influences came from Terror Behind the Walls, the massive Halloween attraction hosted at Eastern State for years. While entirely staged, it introduced millions of visitors to the prison. Capone's image often appears in promotional material and tour dialogue, adding a familiar face to the bone-chilling history. Outside of media production, some of the most compelling stories come from staff and preservation workers. These accounts include hearing music, voices, and footsteps during overnight shifts, especially near Capone's cell, which is still furnished despite a fresh coat of paint to this day. Whether coincidence or expectation, these experiences continue to reinforce the idea that the prison holds emotional residue tied to its most famous inmate. Now, while Capone's stay was brief, it was able to expose cracks in the system and give the prison a face that audiences could recognize. Capone did not need to suffer to leave a mark. His name alone was enough. Now, while Capone did not exactly suffer the same way the other inmates do, there was no torture involved. One of the most chilling stories tied to Eastern State and Capone is that of Jimmy Clark, a low-ranking mobster killed during the St. Valentine's Day massacre. It is said that Capone felt Jimmy sharing his cell, hearing him in the night, speaking to him when no one else was there. Fellow inmates and guards sometimes reported Capone screaming or quietly conversing with an unseen presence. Even after his release, the haunting reportedly followed him to Alcatraz, and even to his estate in Palm Island. Capone's fear of Jimmy's spirit became so intense that his bodyguards would rush to his room, convinced that he was under attack, only to find him alone and terrified. Could Jimmy be the one still lingering back in Capone's cell today? As I mentioned before, some notable bank robbers were also housed in Eastern State. Slick Willie Sutton, known as the Actor, was a gentleman in appearance but ruthless in practice. Sentenced for a high-profile bank robbery in 1934, Sutton attempted multiple escapes from Eastern State, including one in 1945 through a tunnel with 11 other inmates. Unfortunately for them, they broke through to the other side during the day and were spotted immediately by a patrol car and captured. Then there's Victor Babe Andreoli, convicted of murdering a Pennsylvania state police officer. Sent to Eastern State for life, he escaped in 1943 but was ultimately caught and killed in a diner, declaring he would never be taken alive. Some would rather live with their head on a swivel than sustain what Eastern State Penitentiary would put them through. The women of Eastern State left their spectral traces as well. Frida Frost, convicted of murdering her husband by poisoning him, was the last female prisoner, transferred in 1923. Her departure marked the end of an era, but some believe her spirit still lingers, particularly in areas formerly occupied by female inmates, carrying whispers of vengeance, sorrow, and regret. But the hauntings are not only tied to famous names. The very architecture of Eastern State seems to hold memory. Cell Block 4 is known for shadow figures and faces appearing in the corridors, sometimes beckoning visitors closer. Locksmith Gary Johnson, tasked with replacing locks, felt an overwhelming unseen force. He saw distorted faces lining the walls and sensed energy so intense it seemed almost alive, leaping at him from nowhere. Cell Block 12 is a hotspot for disembodied voices, whispers, cackles, and footsteps that cannot be traced. Even seasoned investigators report an overwhelming sense of dread when entering, sometimes accompanied by flickering lights or equipment malfunctions. Some describe feeling touched or scratched by something unseen, as if the suffering of decades has crystallized into presence that cannot move on. Cell Block 6 is haunted by darting shadows along the walls, leaving staff refusing to enter alone at night, reporting black silhouettes gliding down the corridor straight out of the Hogwarts Great Hall. And above, in the upper tiers, lurks the silent observer. A presence that watches from above, felt rather than seen. Visitors describe subtle pressures or the sensation of being followed, adding to the penitentiary's reputation as a place that remembers everyone who has passed through its walls. Even the prison's design seems to amplify the creepy. Narrow corridors, high ceilings, and echoing stone distort sound and depth perception. Metal walkways carry footsteps unnaturally, creating echoes that appear to come from nowhere, but with the sound that travels deep. Occasional childlike giggles or whispers appear in areas that never house children, adding to the unpredictability. But don't worry, parents. Eastern State holds a scavenger hunt for children right on their grounds today. The building itself is an innocent witness to all of the horrible things, carrying memory in stone and iron. Eastern State does not give answers, it gives fragments, and it is those fragments that makes the penitentiary eternally unsettled. Eastern State Penitentiary is not about proving what exists nor debunking it. It's about observing what remains, noticing the spaces where experiences fails to align with reason, and exploring what persists when stories, history, and expectation collide. Here, the unexplained is not a flaw. It is a feature, and it's precisely what makes the penitentiary what it is today, and it allows these questions to be asked with no real answer. Now, much like Waverly Hills, one of the most overlooked aspects of Eastern State Penitentiary is how long it functioned as an active prison compared to its relatively brief life as just a haunted, abandoned location. For more than a century, the rigid routines, schedules, and procedures shaped the environment far more than the sensational incidents that now dominate paranormal lore. The architecture, the weight of the stone walls, and the long echoing corridors that were built for discipline and surveillance, rather than fear, now amplify unease in the imaginations of visitors, much like many aging Gothic structures whose original purpose has been lost to time. While Eastern State housed death row inmates, executions were not carried out on site. There is no complete tally of deaths, but the number of inmates who died from disease, neglect, or psychological and physical abuse likely contributes to its reputation. The absence of precise records leaves room for speculation, allowing tragedy to blur into myth. With its three distinct identities as a functioning prison, an abandoned structure, and eventually a tourist attraction, Eastern State has been repeatedly redefined. Each transformation altered how the building was remembered. Paranormal claims are often attributed entirely to its years as an active prison, even when many reported experiences occurred decades later, long after the routines and lives that once defined the space had disappeared. Sure, you might take a tour and catch a shadow, hear a footstep echo, or feel a chill run down your spine. Or maybe you'll notice just the wind whistling through broken windows or the stone settling under its own weight. Most haunted spots lose their edge once the scares become predictable. Eastern State doesn't. We want explanations, names, and causes. Instead, we get fragments. We get Al Capone and the other infamous names that have come through the Eastern State walls. You get a figure glimpsed in a corridor, a story repeated on a tour by Steve Buscemi. Pieces that make the experience easier to talk about, but never fully explain. Beyond those fragments lie moments that refuse to be neat, experiences that resist a tidy story, but they leave the question open. This place doesn't need one defining ghost or mobster to feel alive. Time, architecture, the torture that was here, and the people who walk the halls today hoping to see or feel something are enough. The same space doesn't behave the same for everyone, and that unpredictability is exactly what keeps this legend alive. In the next episode, we remain in confinement, but this time it's a place where sanity and suffering walk side by side. A place where human endurance was pushed to its absolute limits, and the echoes of that struggle still linger. Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum. I'm Johnny Clash, and this is Paranormal Unsettled. Thanks for listening.
Paranormal Unsettled is written and produced by Johnny Clash. Want more unsettling content? Subscribe to Johnny Clash XP on YouTube and Paranormal Unsettled on TikTok. For gaming content, follow on Twitch and social media at Johnny FN Clash.